Caleb Morris didn't just leave, he made it a show. He yanked the diamond from Janet Brown's finger with a force that left her skin raw, then snatched the microphone from the altar. The feedback shrieked through the chapel, matching the scream caught in Janet's throat. "I'm not marrying a woman who's only good for my image," Caleb's voice boomed, amplified and cruel. "I'm done." He dropped the mic, a heavy, hollow thud, and walked. Janet stood frozen, her voluminous white silk dress suddenly feeling like a shroud. Guests whispered. 300 phones rose like a digital firing squad. Her vision blurred with tears as she kicked off her heels and ran after him, her bare feet hitting the cold marble. She reached the heavy oak doors, and a firm, warm hand clamped around her wrist. "Don't," a voice commanded, deep with a velvet edge. Janet looked up into the dark, focused eyes of a man who looked like he belonged in a war room, not a wedding. A dark tattoo peeked from the collar of his charcoal suit, snaking up his neck. "Let me go," Janet sobbed. "I have to." "You don't have to chase a coward," Kim Rowland said, his grip steady and grounding. "You need to stand with a king. Let him go, Janet. I'll take it from here." Hello, family. Welcome to Afro Soul Mafia Stories. Before we proceed to the story, I would love to know where you are watching from. Kindly drop it in the comments section and also subscribe to this channel. Now let's continue with the story. The heavy oak doors creaked as they swung shut, cutting off any hope Janet had of catching the man who had just dismantled her life. She stood trembling, her chest heaving against the tight lace of her bodice, her bare soles stinging against the cold, unforgiving marble. The grip on her wrist was firm, not painful, but absolute. It was an anchor in a world that had suddenly turned to water. "Look at them, Janet," Kim Rowland said, his voice a low, melodic baritone that somehow carried over the rising storm of whispers behind them. Janet turned her head slowly. The 300 guests she once called friends were leaning into the aisle, their faces illuminated by the ghoulish blue light of their phone screens. They weren't mourning her heartbreak, they were recording it. "They are waiting for the collapse," Kim continued, his dark, focused eyes never leaving hers. "They are waiting for you to crawl after a man who isn't worth the dirt on your feet. Is that the story you want told?" "He left me," she whispered, a stray tear carving a path through the makeup on her cheek. "Everyone saw it." "Then let them see this." Kim didn't wait for an answer. He shifted his grip, sliding his hand down from her wrist to lace his fingers firmly through hers. His hand was large, warm, and scarred across the knuckles, a stark contrast to Caleb's soft, pampered grip. Without a word of apology to the onlookers, he began to walk. He didn't lead her to the exit. He turned her around and began the long march back toward the altar. The church fell into a sudden, vacuum-like silence. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of Kim's leather shoes and the soft, ghostly slap of Janet's bare feet on the stone. Kim walked with a terrifying, predatory grace, his broad shoulders squared, his slicked-back hair catching the light of the chandeliers. The intricate tattoo on his neck seemed to pulse with every step, a silent warning to anyone brave enough to speak. In the front row, Caleb Morris stood frozen. He had stopped his retreat, his shocked arrogance crumbling into a pale, sickly mask. His jaw dropped as he watched the man in the charcoal suit approach. He looked small, a boy playing dress-up in a tuxedo, compared to the dangerous sophistication of the man holding Janet's hand. They reached the steps of the altar. The priest, a silver-haired man who looked as though he wanted to disappear into the floorboards, clutched his Bible to his chest. "Sir," the priest stammered, the ceremony has been vacated." Kim Rowland didn't look at the priest. He turned his head slightly, fixing his gaze on Caleb, who was standing just a few feet away, shaking with a mixture of rage and confusion. Kim's eyes were like ice, cold and final. "The groom?" Kim asked, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. He looked at Caleb for a fleeting, dismissive second, the way one might look at a stain on a rug. Then he looked back at the priest. "The groom was a mistake." He stepped closer to Janet, his presence radiating a heat that shielded her from the judgmental stares of the crowd. He took the ring, a heavy, platinum band with a black stone that he pulled from his own vest pocket, and held it up. "I am the correction," Kim declared. The silence in the church was so heavy it felt physical. Janet felt the air return to her lungs. She looked at Caleb, whose face had gone from red to a ghostly, translucent white. He looked like a rat backed into a corner, his main man energy evaporated. He tried to speak, to perhaps reclaim his dignity or shout an insult, but Kim's gaze pinned him to the spot. Kim turned back to Janet. For the first time, the coldness in his eyes softened, replaced by a fierce, possessive protection. He didn't ask her if she was okay. He didn't need to. He took her hand, his thumb stroking the raw skin where Caleb had ripped the previous ring away. "The ceremony continues," Kim said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "But this time, we do it right." Janet looked at the man she had only known for minutes, a man who represented everything dangerous and unknown. But as she looked at his sharp jawline and felt the unwavering strength in his hand, the humiliation that had threatened to drown her began to recede. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was being claimed by a king, and for the first time that day, she didn't want to run. She stood tall, her disheveled white dress flowing around her like armor, and nodded to the priest. The reversal was complete. The tragedy was dead, and a new, much more dangerous story had just begun. The transition from the chaos of the cathedral to the interior of Kim Rowland's car was like falling into a sensory vacuum. One moment, Janet was the center of a 300-person scandal. The next, she was encased in a tomb of hand-stitched leather and smoked glass. The door of the heavy, matte black SUV had closed with a pressurized thump that seemed to swallow the sounds of the city and the distant, frantic shouting of Caleb Morris. Janet sat deep in the plush rear seat, her massive wedding dress, once a symbol of a bright future, now looking like a dying white bird taking up every inch of available space. She stared down at her feet. They were stained gray with the dust of the church floor, looking small and defenseless against the pristine, deep-pile carpet of the vehicle. The shock was finally settling in, manifesting as a violent shiver that started in her spine and radiated outward until her teeth began to chatter. Kim Rowland sat beside her, but not too close. He gave her space, yet his presence was a physical weight she could feel against her skin. He had discarded his suit jacket, revealing the stark white of his dress shirt and the way the dark ink of his neck tattoo disappeared beneath his collar. He didn't look at her with pity. He didn't even look at her with curiosity. He simply looked ahead, his sharp jawline set in a mask of dangerous sophistication. The car moved with a terrifying, silent speed. Outside the reinforced windows, the world was a blur of neon lights and late afternoon shadows. Janet watched the familiar landmarks of her neighborhood flicker past and then vanish, replaced by the towering glass and steel of the city's elite district, a world she had only ever seen from the outside. "Where are you taking me?" she finally whispered. Her voice sounded thin, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. Kim didn't turn his head, but his dark eyes shifted toward her reflection in the window. "To a place where Caleb Morris doesn't exist. To a place where you can decide if you want to be a victim or a wife." "I don't even know you," she said, her hands trembling as she clutched a fistful of lace. "You stood up there and told everyone you were the correction. Why?" Kim finally turned. The movement was slow, deliberate. He leaned back, his broad shoulders filling the frame of the seat. "Because I hate waste, Janet, and seeing a woman like you beg for the crumbs of a coward's affection was a waste of a perfectly good life. I'm not a hero. I'm a man who sees an opportunity and claims it." The car began a steep ascent, spiraling up a private ramp that led into the heart of a gleaming skyscraper. The air grew thinner, the light more golden. Janet felt a strange, dizzying sensation, as if the higher they climbed, the more the Janet Brown who loved Caleb Morris was being left behind, discarded like the shoes she'd lost at the altar. When the vehicle finally glided to a halt, the doors were opened by a man in a black suit who stood with the rigid posture of a soldier. Janet hesitated, her bare feet hovering over the edge of the door frame. The cold air of the underground garage bit at her skin. Before she could move, Kim was there. He didn't offer a hand this time. He simply stood as a shield between her and the world, his shadow long and protective. "Step out, Janet," he said, his voice a low command that brooked no argument. "The penthouse is yours, for as long as you need to realize that the man you were chasing was never big enough to hold you." She stepped out, her toes sinking into the polished concrete, and followed the broad-shouldered man in black toward the private elevator. The doors slid open to reveal a world of marble, glass, and silent power. Far below, her old life was still screaming in the church, But up here, in Kim Rowland's world, there was only the quiet, terrifying promise of a new beginning. The elevator doors opened directly into a foyer of obsidian and gold, leading into a living space so vast it made the cathedral feel cramped. The penthouse was a cathedral of a different sort, one built to the gods of industry and shadow. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls revealed a sprawling metropolis that looked like a carpet of fallen stars, but Janet couldn't bring herself to look at the view. She felt small, a white lace ghost haunting a billionaire's sanctuary. Kim Rowland moved through the space with the ease of a man who owned the air itself. He gestured toward a sofa made of butter-soft charcoal leather. "Sit, Janet. You're shaking, and I don't want you fainting on my floor." She sat, the voluminous skirt of her wedding dress spilling over the edges of the furniture like a mountain of discarded dreams. A woman in a sharp black uniform appeared silently, placing a glass of amber liquid and a warm cashmere throw on the table before vanishing again. Janet wrapped the throw around her shoulders, the warmth doing little to stop the internal chill. Kim didn't sit. He poured himself a drink and stood by the glass wall, his silhouette framed by the city lights. The slicked-back undercut of his hair stayed perfect, his dangerous sophistication intact even as the night deepened. "Why?" Janet's voice was stronger now, though still edged with the raw pain of Caleb's betrayal. "You said you hate waste, but men like you don't save women for free. What is this, Kim? Is this a prison with a better view?" Kim turned, the light catching the sharp angle of his jaw and the dark, intricate ink on his neck. "It's a contract," he said, his tone devoid of the warmth Caleb used to fake. "I am a man of considerable resources, Janet, but in my world, the world of high-stakes investments and family-run syndicates, an unattached man is seen as a loose cannon. My board of directors wants a stable image. They want a man who is settled, a man with a wife who commands respect." He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes locked on hers. "You were supposed to marry a man who would have spent your life making you feel small so he could feel big. I am offering you the opposite. You will be Mrs. Rowland. You will have a name that makes people stop talking when you enter a room. You will have a staff, a bank account with no ceiling, and a security detail that would die before letting Caleb Morris within a mile of you." Janet looked down at the heavy black stone ring Kim had placed on her finger at the altar. It felt heavy, a physical weight of obligation. "And in return, I'm just a prop, a face for your board meetings." "You are my protection," Kim corrected, his voice dropping to a low, vibrato rumble. "And I am yours. Caleb didn't just reject you today, he tried to destroy your social existence. He wanted you to spend the rest of your life as the jilted bride. By tomorrow morning, the headlines won't mention his name. They will be talking about how the most powerful man in the underworld stole his bride at the altar because he couldn't wait another second to have her." Janet felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in years, a cold, sharp hunger for justice. "You're offering me revenge." "I am offering you a total status swap," Kim said, stepping closer until he stood directly over her. He smelled of sandalwood and expensive tobacco. "Caleb Morris wanted to humiliate you. By the time I'm done, he will be a footnote in your biography. He will realize that by throwing you away, he handed his greatest asset to his greatest enemy." He leaned down, placing his hands on the back of the sofa, effectively walling her in with his broad-shouldered frame. The proximity was electric, a mix of terror and a strange, grounding safety. "The terms are simple," he whispered. "You live here, you play the part of a woman who chose me over him. You never chase him, you never answer his calls, and you never look back. In exchange, I will make you untouchable." Janet looked into those dark, intense eyes. There was no love there yet, only a fierce, possessive certainty. She thought of Caleb's sneer and the shocked arrogance on his face when Kim had taken her hand. She thought of the 300 phones recording her shame. Slowly, she reached out and placed her hand over the scarred knuckles of Kim's hand. "I don't want to be a victim anymore," she said, her voice finally steady. "Good," Kim replied, a ghost of a smirk touching his lips. "Because Kim Rowland doesn't marry victims, he builds queens." 48 hours after the wedding that never was, the world had shifted on its axis. Caleb Morris sat in his dimly lit apartment, the blue light of his phone screen reflecting in eyes that were no longer red with anger, but wide with a frantic, gnawing desperation. Every social media feed he scrolled through told the same story, and it wasn't the one he had scripted. The viral clips didn't show a broken Janet Brown begging for his return. They showed a cinematic goddess being led away by a man who looked like he could buy and sell Caleb's entire family line without checking his bank balance. The headlines were relentless. The King of Soul claims the abandoned bride. Who is Kim Rowland? The mystery man who saved the wedding. Caleb's shocked arrogance had curdled into a bitter, toxic regret. He hadn't wanted Janet, but he certainly hadn't wanted her to become the most envied woman in the city within an hour of his rejection. Driven by a cocktail of bruised ego and the sudden realization that he had thrown away a winning lottery ticket, Caleb grabbed his car keys. He convinced himself that Janet was being held captive, that she was scared, and that deep down, she was still the woman who would chase him through a church in her bare feet. He didn't make it past the lobby of the skyscraper. The building was a fortress of glass and steel, guarded by men who didn't look like standard security guards. They looked like shadows in tailored suits. Caleb tried to push past the front desk, his voice rising with a performative bravado. "I'm here for Janet Brown. Tell her Caleb is here to take her home." The receptionist didn't even look up. She simply touched a button. Two men appeared from the sleek marble pillars behind Caleb. They were built like the broad-shouldered Kim Rowland, their faces set in expressions of absolute indifference. One of them, a man with a jagged scar running through his eyebrow, stepped into Caleb's personal space. "Mr. Morris," the guard said, his voice a low, gravelly warning. "You are trespassing on private property." "Trespassing? That's my fiancée up there," Caleb barked, though his voice cracked at the end. "She's being brainwashed by that Korean thug. Let me through." The guard didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply placed a heavy hand on Caleb's shoulder. The grip was a silent promise of violence. "There is no Janet Brown in this building. There is only Mrs. Rowland, and she has expressed a very specific desire never to see your face again." "Mrs. Rowland, it's been 2 days," Caleb laughed, a high-pitched, hysterical sound. "She's playing a game. She's trying to make me jealous. Tell her it worked, okay? Tell her I'm sorry about the microphone thing. Just let me up." The elevator chattered softly, the doors sliding open to reveal Kim Rowland himself. He was dressed in a crisp white shirt, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that were lean and corded with muscle. He didn't look like a man who had just woken up. He looked like a man who had just finished deciding the fate of a small nation. Kim stepped into the lobby, his presence instantly draining the oxygen from the room. He didn't approach Caleb. He stopped 10 feet away, his hands in his pockets, his dangerous sophistication radiating like a cold front. "You have 10 seconds to leave this building under your own power, Caleb," Kim said. He didn't raise his voice, which made it infinitely more terrifying. "After that, my team will ensure you leave in a way that requires a hospital stay." Caleb's face went from its usual smugness to a translucent, sickly white. He looked at Kim, the slicked-back undercut, the dark ink on his neck, the sheer, unbothered wealth, and finally understood that he wasn't dealing with a romantic rival. He was dealing with a predator. "You can't keep her," Caleb stammered, backing toward the glass revolving doors. "She loves me. She'll realize who you are." Kim tilted his head, a ghost of a smirk touching his lips. It was the look of a man watching a rat try to roar. "She already knows who I am, Caleb. I'm the man who kept the ring on her finger while you were busy playing with a microphone. Now, get out, before I decide that your existence is an inconvenience I no longer wish to tolerate." Caleb didn't wait for the count of 10. He turned and fled, his expensive shoes scuffing the marble as he ran toward the street, looking small, defeated, and utterly irrelevant. Upstairs, behind the one-way glass of the penthouse, Janet Brown watched the tiny figure of Caleb Morris scramble into his car and speed away. She didn't feel the urge to run after him. She didn't even feel the sting of his betrayal. She felt a strange, cold peace. She turned away from the window, her traumatized elegance shifting into something harder, something sharper. She was no longer the girl who had been humiliated. She was the woman who had survived, and the man downstairs was making sure she never had to survive alone again. The massive wedding dress, a cloud of silk that had become a heavy, salt-stained anchor, lay in a heap on the marble floor of the penthouse dressing room. Janet stood in a simple silk robe, her reflection staring back at her from a dozen different angles in the floor-to-ceiling mirrors. She felt unmoored, a ghost of the woman who had walked into the church 48 hours ago. The door chided open, and Kim Rowland stepped in. He wasn't alone. Behind him was a small army of people in black uniforms, pushing racks of clothing that shimmered like liquid precious metals. There were boxes of shoes that cost more than Caleb's car and jewelry cases that looked like they belonged in a museum. Kim walked over to the discarded wedding dress. He didn't touch it with his hands. Instead, he nudged the hem with the toe of his polished shoe. This dress was bought with his money, wasn't it? Janet nodded, her throat tight. Caleb chose it. He said it made me look manageable. Kim's eyes darkened, the dangerous sophistication in his gaze sharpening into a cold, focused intent. He looked at the lead assistant and made a sharp gesture. Get it out of here. Take everything in the guest suite that she brought with her. The clothes, the bags, the trinkets. If Caleb Morris touched it or paid for it, it doesn't belong in this house. Kim, that's everything I own, Janet whispered, a flicker of her traumatized elegance, returning as she watched the staff begin to bag her old life. No, Kim said, stepping toward her until the scent of sandalwood and cold air enveloped her. He reached out, his thumb tracing the sharp line of her jaw. That was the inventory of a victim. You are starting a new ledger. He turned her toward the racks of high-fashion couture. These were curated this morning. Silk, cashmere, structured wool, nothing that makes you look manageable. These are clothes for a woman who is seen and feared. One by one, the staff began to present the pieces. There was a charcoal gray suit with shoulders as sharp as Kim's own, a deep emerald gown that looked like a second skin, and a leather trench coat that felt like armor. As each piece was hung in the cedar-lined closets, the air in the room seemed to change. The scent of old life and wedding lilies was being systematically replaced by the smell of new leather and expensive perfume. Kim picked up a pair of stiletto heels, black, obsidian-sharp, and dangerously high. He knelt, not out of subservience, but with a terrifyingly intimate focus. He took Janet's foot in his hand, his rough, calloused palm a stark contrast to her soft skin, and slid the shoe on. You spent years trying to fit into the life Caleb built for you, Kim said, looking up at her from his position on one knee. His slicked-back hair was perfect, his dark eyes unwavering. He wanted a bride he could humiliate. I want a partner who can stand beside me while I set the world on fire. Janet looked at herself in the mirror. The transformation wasn't just physical. The woman in the mirror didn't look like she was waiting for a lifeline. She looked like the lifeline. The sharp lines of the new couture erased the softness of her heartbreak. Every piece Kim had chosen was a statement of power, a visual stamp of her new status as Mrs. Rowland. Why go to this much trouble? She asked, her voice finally losing its tremor. Kim stood up, closing the distance between them. He reached for the heavy black stone ring on her finger, twisting it slightly so it caught the light. Because when we walk out of this penthouse tomorrow, the world needs to see that you didn't just survive. You ascended. I'm not just replacing your wardrobe, Janet. I'm erasing the version of you that Caleb was allowed to hurt. He gestured to a small, velvet-lined box on the vanity. Inside was a necklace of black diamonds that looked like drops of frozen night. Put it on, he commanded softly. The past is gone. From tonight, you only wear what I give you, and I give you everything. Janet reached for the diamonds, her fingers steady. As the cold stones settled against her skin, she felt the last remnants of the jilted bride dissolve. She wasn't Janet Brown anymore. She was forged into something new, something Kim Rowland had curated with the same ruthless precision he used to run his empire. The penthouse was no longer just a sanctuary of glass and silk. It was becoming a command center. As the sun dipped below the skyline, the quiet luxury of the afternoon was replaced by a low, rhythmic hum of activity that Janet hadn't yet witnessed. The sliding mahogany doors that led to Kim's private study, doors that had remained firmly shut since her arrival, were now thrown open, spilling a cold, blue light into the hallway. Janet moved toward the opening, her bare feet silent on the heated floors, the hem of her new emerald silk robe whispering against her ankles. She stopped at the threshold, the traumatized elegance of her expression sharpening into a look of wary fascination. Inside, the room was thick with the scent of ozone and expensive espresso. Kim Rowland sat behind a desk of solid obsidian, but he wasn't the polished billionaire she had seen in the car. He had discarded his shirt entirely, his broad-shouldered frame hunched over a series of glowing monitors. In the harsh light, the tattoo on his neck revealed its true scale. It wasn't just a mark, but a sprawling, intricate masterpiece of ink that cascaded down his spine and across his chest. A dragon trapped in a storm of traditional Korean clouds. Every muscle in his back moved with a predatory tension as he spoke into a headset in rapid-fire Korean, his voice a series of low, guttural commands. 6 men stood in a semicircle around him. They weren't the men in suits from the lobby. These men wore tactical black, their sleeves rolled up to reveal matching ink on their forearms, marks of a loyalty that went deeper than a paycheck. When Kim spoke, they didn't just listen, they leaned in as if his words were law. There was no room for debate in this circle. One of the men, a giant with a scarred jaw, noticed Janet standing in the doorway. He didn't move toward her, but his hand hovered near the hem of his jacket in a gesture that made her blood run cold. Kim's head snapped up. His eyes, usually calm and focused, were currently cold and dangerous, vibrating with the intensity of whatever war he was waging on the screens. When he saw Janet, the fire in his gaze didn't extinguish, but it redirected. "Wait outside," he said to the men. It wasn't a request. The 6 men bowed in unison, a synchronized display of intense loyalty that felt more like a religious rite than a business exit, and filed past her. Not one of them made eye contact. They treated her like she was an extension of Kim himself, a ghost they weren't permitted to acknowledge. Kim leaned back, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in his dark eyes. He reached for a silk shirt draped over his chair, but he didn't put it on immediately. He let her see him, the ink, the scars, the raw reality of the man beneath the custom-tailored suits. "You're seeing the Mafia now, aren't you, Janet?" he asked, his voice returning to that velvet baritone. "The part that Caleb Morris warned you about." Janet stepped into the room, the scent of his world wrapping around her. "I'm seeing that you weren't lying. You don't just have an image to protect. You have a kingdom to run." "An empire," Kim corrected. He stood up, his athletic frame casting a long shadow that swallowed her own. "And empires aren't built on manageable brides or Churchill apologies. They are built on the things people are too afraid to look at." He walked toward her, the dragon on his chest appearing to move with every breath. He stopped just inches away, the heat from his skin radiating against her silk robe. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line where the ink on his neck met his jaw. "Those men would jump off this balcony if I told them it would save my interests," Kim whispered. "That is the world you married into, Janet. It's a world of hushed meetings and blood oaths. Caleb gave you a life of whispers behind your back. I'm giving you a life where the world goes silent when you speak." Janet looked at the monitors, codes, maps, and financial streams she couldn't begin to decode. This was the secret world, the dangerous engine that powered her new life. For the first time, she realized that Kim Rowland wasn't just her protector, he was the storm itself. And instead of feeling the panic that had drowned her at the altar, she felt a strange, intoxicating pull. "Are you afraid?" Kim asked. His eyes searched hers for the flicker of the victim she used to be. Janet reached up, her fingers hovering just an inch from the dark ink on his shoulder. "No," she said, her voice finally losing the last of its trauma. "I'm learning." Kim's smirk returned, the sharp, possessive look of a man who had found exactly what he was looking for. "Good, because tomorrow the world watches us, and they need to see that the Queen of Rowland doesn't flinch at shadows." The grand ballroom of the Plaza Emerald was a sea of crystal chandeliers and whispered secrets, a place where reputations were either polished to a shine or ground into the dirt. As the heavy gilded doors swung open, the ambient noise of 100 elite conversations died a sudden, synchronized death. Janet Brown entered first. She was no longer the barefoot girl in a shredded wedding gown. She was a vision of traumatized elegance, reborn as cold, hard power. She wore the deep emerald gown Kim had chosen for her, a dress that moved like liquid grass and clung to her frame with a defiant grace. The black diamond necklace sat against her collarbone like a promise, its dark fire catching the light. Beside her, Kim Rowland was the embodiment of dangerous sophistication. His charcoal suit was so perfectly tailored it looked like armor, and his slicked-back hair didn't have a single strand out of place. He didn't just walk into the room, he took possession of it. He kept one hand firmly on the small of Janet's back, a possessive, grounding touch that told every person in that room exactly where she stood. "Keep your head up, Janet," Kim murmured, his voice a low vibration that only she could hear. "You aren't here to be judged, you're here to be envied." They moved through the crowd like a storm front. The intense loyalty of Kim's world was visible even here, as men in suits twice the size of normal humans cleared a path for them without saying a word. Janet felt the eyes on her, the same eyes that had watched her humiliation through phone screens only days ago. But now, those eyes were wide with a mix of shock and reluctant awe. Then she saw him. Caleb Morris was standing near the bar, clutching a champagne flute as if it were a life preserver. He looked small. His tuxedo, which he had once worn with such shocked arrogance, now looked ill-fitting and cheap. When his eyes met Janet's, his face went that familiar, translucent white. He looked like he wanted to run, but the sheer density of the crowd and the presence of the man beside Janet pinned him to the spot. Kim didn't avoid him. In fact, he steered Janet directly toward the bar. Caleb's hand shook, the champagne slopping over the rim of his glass. "Janet," he stammered, his voice thin and desperate. I tried to call. We need to talk about what happened. This is all moving too fast, you're not thinking." Kim stopped. He didn't let go of Janet. Instead, he pulled her closer, his arm wrapping around her waist in a gesture of absolute ownership. He looked at Caleb with a calm and focused intensity that was far more terrifying than a shout. "Mr. Morris," Kim said, his voice cutting through the silence of the surrounding guests. "I believe I told you once before, your existence is an inconvenience. Do not make it a habit to address my wife." "She's not your wife," Caleb hissed, a final, pathetic spark of his old arrogance flickering. "You stole her. You took advantage of a bad situation." Kim didn't flinch. He reached out with his free hand, his rough, calloused palm resting momentarily on the black diamonds at Janet's throat. He looked at the crowd, then back at Caleb, a ghost of a predatory smirk touching his lips. "I didn't steal her, Caleb. I recognized her value when you were too blind to see it," Kim said. Then he turned to Janet, his eyes softening into a look that was both protective and dangerously intimate. "Tell him, Janet. Tell him whose hand you're holding." Janet looked at Caleb. She looked at the man who had tried to shatter her in front of 300 people. She felt the strength of Kim's arm around her, the weight of the protection he had built for her, and the secret world he had invited her into. The trauma bond that had once held her to Caleb didn't just snap, it evaporated. "You're right about one thing, Caleb," Janet said, her voice clear and resonant. "I'm not thinking about what happened, I'm thinking about what's next." She leaned into Kim, her eyes never leaving Caleb's shrinking form. "And I'm exactly where I belong." Kim didn't wait for Caleb's response. He turned Janet away, his hand sliding back to the small of her back as they glided toward the center of the floor. As the music swelled, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. Behind them, Caleb Morris stood alone, a footnote in the story of a woman who had transitioned from a victim to a queen. Janet didn't look back. She was too busy looking at the dangerous man who had given her a lifeline and realizing she was finally ready to pull him closer. The aftermath of the debut was supposed to be a victory lap, but in Kim Rowland's world, a rise in status always invited a rise in stakes. They were leaving the gala, the cool night air a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the ballroom, when the silence of the private parking garage was shattered. It happened in a heartbeat. The screech of tires, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of suppressed gunfire, and the sudden, violent eruption of glass from the rear window of the SUV. "Get down!" Kim's voice wasn't a velvet baritone anymore, it was a guttural roar. Before Janet could scream, she was tackled. Kim didn't just pull her to the ground, he threw his entire broad-shouldered frame over hers, pinning her against the cold concrete behind the wheel of the armored vehicle. The dangerous sophistication he had worn all night vanished, replaced by the raw, lethal energy of the dragon tattooed on his back. Janet's cheek was pressed against the stone, her emerald silk dress catching on the grit of the floor. She could hear the intense loyalty of Kim's men in action, the shouting in rapid-fire Korean, the return fire, the heavy footsteps of soldiers moving to close the perimeter. But all she could truly feel was the crushing weight of Kim's body and the frantic, heavy thud of his heart against her spine. "Kim," she gasped, her voice trembling. "Kim, you're hurting me." He didn't move. He stayed locked over her, his hands shielding the back of her head. Only when the sound of the retreating rival vehicle faded into a distant whine did he finally shift. When he pulled back to look at her, the cold mask was gone. For the first time, the stoic Mafia boss looked terrified. His slicked-back hair was disheveled, a single strand falling over eyes that were wide and dark with a desperate, frantic hunger. He scanned her face, his hands, rough and calloused, trembling as they cupped her cheeks. "Are you hit? Janet, look at me. Are you bleeding?" "I'm fine," she whispered, reaching up to touch his shoulder. Her fingers came away red. "Kim, you're bleeding, your shoulder." He didn't even glance at the wound where a shard of glass or a stray bullet had grazed him. He let out a breath that sounded like a sob, leaning forward until his forehead rested against hers. The man who commanded empires, the man who had stood at the altar and claimed he was the correction, was shaking. "They touched you," he hissed, his voice vibrating with a primal rage that made the air feel thick. "They tried to take you." "I'm okay," Janet said, her traumatized elegance giving way to a strange, newfound strength. She realized in that moment that she wasn't just a respectable image for his board of directors. She wasn't just a prop. Kim pulled her into his chest, his grip so tight it took her breath away. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, right where the black diamonds lay. "If I lost you," he muttered, the words muffled against her skin, "there would be nothing left to build. I thought I was using you, Janet. I thought this was just another move on the board." He pulled back just enough to look into her expressive eyes, his thumb wiping away a smudge of soot from her cheek. The secret world was no longer a mystery to her. She was seeing the heart of it. It wasn't just about blood and oaths. It was about the terrifying weight of loving something more than power. "I won't let them do it again," Kim promised, his voice cracking with an emotion he had clearly spent years trying to bury. "I will burn this city to the ground before I let another shadow fall over you." Janet didn't flinch at the violence in his tone. She reached out, tracing the dark ink of the tattoo on his neck, feeling the pulse beneath it. The broken vow of her wedding day felt like a lifetime ago. Caleb Morris had left her because he was a coward. Kim Rowland was willing to die for her because he was a king. In the dark of the garage, surrounded by the smell of cordite and the blue flash of security lights, Janet didn't feel like a victim. She felt like the center of a universe. She leaned into him, her emerald dress stained with his blood, and for the first time, she wasn't just leaning into a savior. She was leaning into her husband. 1 year had passed since the marble floor of the cathedral had chilled Janet's bare feet, and tonight, she stood before a different mirror in a world that had become her own. The woman staring back was no longer the discarded bride with tear-stained cheeks and a shattered heart. This woman wore her traumatized elegance, like a suit of armor, refined by a year of navigating the dangerous sophistication of the Rowland Empire. Her expressive eyes were clear, the panic of the past replaced by a quiet, unwavering power. She was draped in silk the color of midnight, and the black diamond necklace, once a symbol of a strategic rescue, now looked like a permanent part of her skin. She barely recognized the ghost of the girl she used to be. That girl had defined her worth by Caleb Morris's approval. This woman had learned to define it by the weight of her own word and the loyalty she commanded at Kim's side. The heavy mahogany doors of the dressing room opened, and Kim Rowland stepped in. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the edge of the dragon tattoo that snaked up his neck. He didn't look like a man in a rush to close a deal or win a war. He looked like a man who had finally come home. He walked toward her, his reflection joining hers in the glass, tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably composed. He didn't speak at first. He simply stood behind her, his rough, calloused hands resting gently on her waist. The heat of him was grounding, a familiar sanctuary in a life built on high stakes and shadows. "What are you looking for, Janet?" he asked, his voice a low, melodic baritone that vibrated through her. "The girl from the church," she whispered, leaning back into the solid strength of his chest. "I can't find her anymore." "Good," Kim murmured, his dark eyes meeting hers in the mirror with a calm and focused intensity. "She was a tragedy. You are a masterpiece." He turned her around slowly, his hands sliding up to cup her face. The cold mask he wore for the world was completely gone, replaced by the fierce, protective love he had revealed the night the bullets flew in the garage. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside sat a new ring, Not the heavy black stone of their strategic arrangement, but a flawless, brilliant diamond that seemed to hold its own light. "A year ago, I took your hand because I hated waste," Kim said, his voice dropping to a raw, intimate hush. "I married you to protect an image and to give you a shield, but I didn't know then that you would become the air I breathe. I didn't know that the correction I promised would end up being the only thing that ever made sense in my life." He dropped to one knee, not as the Mafia boss commanding a room, but as a man offering his soul. The secret world they lived in faded away, leaving only the two of them in the quiet luxury of the penthouse. "Janet Brown," he said, using her name with a reverence that made her heart ache. "The first time was for revenge. The first time was for show. But tonight, I am asking you to choose me, not because you're running from a coward and not because you need a savior. Choose me because you want to build a kingdom with a man who will never let go of your hand." Janet looked down at him, the slicked-back undercut, the scars on his knuckles, the absolute certainty in his gaze. She thought of Caleb's shocked arrogance and how small that life had been. She thought of the woman in the mirror, the woman Kim had helped her become. For the first time, she wasn't grabbing a lifeline out of desperation. She was reaching for a future she had earned. She reached down, her fingers trembling with a different kind of emotion as she traced the line of his jaw. "Yes," she whispered, the word firm and resonant. "Yes, Kim, for myself, for us." He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit for the woman she had become. As he stood and pulled her into a kiss that tasted of sandalwood and victory, Janet realized the transformation was complete. The discarded bride was dead. In her place stood a queen, and as they looked out over the city lights from their balcony, she knew that for the first time in her life, she wasn't just safe, she was home. Caleb really thought he could humiliate Janet and she'd have nobody. Little did he know he was handing her to a king. Do you think Janet was right to say yes to Kim Rowland, or is he too dangerous for her? Drop a yes if you're Team Kim. Thank you for staying with us, and don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment.